Picture this. I was sitting across from a Swiss manufacturing executive just the other day. Usually this guy is the definition of Swiss, cool, stoic, precise, totally unshakable.
Right.
But lately, he's been a wreck. I mean, he kept tapping his finger on the table, obsessing over exactly one number, 39%.
The tariff.
The crushing punitive tariff rate the U.S. had slapped on his exports. He described it to me like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a straw. He looked resigned, almost ready to accept a slow suffocation of his business. But then, right in the middle of our conversation, his phone buzzed. He glanced down, and the transformation was, it was instant. The gloom just evaporated.
Wow.
He slid the phone across the table to me with this look of absolute disbelief. It was a Bloomberg alert. A deal is imminent. That suffocating 39% rate. The report said it's getting slashed down to 15%.
A lifeline.
An absolute lifeline. Suddenly, the man who was preparing for the worst was practically beaming, talking about momentum and new eras.
I can imagine.
However, what really struck me wasn't just his reaction to the trade news. It was the second thing he mentioned, almost as an afterthought.
Okay.
While the headlines were screaming about tariffs and trade relief, he pointed out something quieter, but, arguably more powerful happening back in Zurich. He mentioned that the Swiss National Bank had just slammed the door shut on negative interest rates.
Right. The other shoe dropping.
Exactly. And it made me realize that this sudden revaluation of the Swiss economy isn't just about political relief. It's a perfect storm of converging policy and trade decisions that's catching the rest of the market completely off guard. We're watching a fundamental recalibration.
That really sets the stage perfectly. And it highlights the central challenge and opportunity facing Switzerland right now. What you're describing are two massive yet distinct tectonic shifts happening at the exact same time.
What?
On one hand, you have that external pressure, a trade war that was just crippling Switzerland's export economy, forcing its businesses to pay tariffs far, far higher than its peers. And now you have the relief.
And on the other, you have that fundamental internal recalculation of monetary strategy by the Swiss National Bank, the end of a decade-long experiment.
Exactly. These two seemingly separate factors, external trade terms and internal interest rates, are converging now to redefine Switzerland's global position, its domestic financial health, and, the future viability of its most critical export sectors.
It's a huge moment.
It is. For the first time in years, the Swiss economy has clear structural direction. But that direction demands a complete overhaul of how Swiss banks and manufacturers operate. It's a huge, high-stakes moment of recalibration for one of the world's most historically stable economies, and we're here to dive into the intricate details of what that means for you.
Okay, let's unpack this perfect storm, starting with the immediate measurable relief, the trade lifeline. We have to understand just how devastating the existing 39% tariff was to really appreciate the relief of getting down to 15%.
We absolutely need to start there by understanding just how devastating that initial tariff wall was. The U.S. had imposed a steep 39% tariff on a broad range of Swiss exports. And this wasn't just a standard duty, it was explicitly punitive. It was designed to apply maximum pressure.
And this rate put Switzerland at a massive, an immediate competitive disadvantage compared to nearly all its advanced peers. What were other similar economies paying at the time?
The comparison is just stark. The U.S. tariff burden on Switzerland stood out as exceptionally severe. If you look at similar trading partners, their effective duties were significantly lower.
Like the EU?
The European Union was facing an average of 15% duties.
Okay, so less than half.
Right. The United Kingdom was at a mere 10%, and Japan also hovered around 15%. So Switzerland was paying more than double what its primary European competitor was paying. This immediately priced Swiss high-value goods out of key segments of the American market.
So why? Why did the U.S. hit Switzerland, a traditionally neutral and, capital-friendly nation, with such an unusually high rate? What was the thinking there?
The U.S. justification, which was rooted primarily in the Trump administration's focus on these bilateral trade balances, was really twofold. And the first part involved a bit of a statistical distortion.
A distortion? How so?
The perception in Washington was that Switzerland generated this massive, ever-growing goods trade surplus with the U.S. But, and this is the crucial part, the official statistics they used to calculate this surplus were seen as distorted by the massive volume of refined gold exports.
Gold. Why would gold exports inflate the perception of a trade deficit?
It's a great question. Because gold moves through Switzerland for refining and shipping, the official trade reports count those very high-value flows. So on paper, it looks like a huge export.
Even though the gold itself wasn't really the target of the tariffs.
Exactly. Gold itself was often exempt from the punitive tariffs, but its sheer volume inflated that headline trade surplus number, which was already pretty substantial, and it made Switzerland look like a much bigger offender on paper than if you only counted industrial and consumer goods.
So that statistical quirk became a political lightning rod.
It did. A numbers game triggering real-world pain.
Fascinating. So what was the second part of the justification, the policy side of things?
The second part was policy rigidity and what the U.S. saw as non-alignment. The U.S. Trade Representative's office criticized Switzerland's trade regime as rigid and slow to adapt to modern priorities.
What does that mean in practice?
Specifically, Switzerland had declined to join recent U.S.-led bilateral deals. These were deals designed to reward countries that align with U.S. interests. Things like strict digital commerce standards, commitments on pharmaceutical pricing reforms, and expanding agricultural market access.
And Switzerland said no.
Well, their non-participation in those alignment efforts was viewed in Washington as a lack of cooperation. It effectively grouped them with economies the U.S. was actively seeking to pressure.
And the economic consequences were immediate and dramatic, not just hypothetical?
Oh, absolutely. Swiss exports to America, which you have to remember is their second largest export market after the EU, valued at over 65 billion Swiss francs annually. They just collapsed.
By how much?
They fell 14% in the 3 months leading up to September 2025. It caused immediate distress across manufacturing supply chains.
And let's ground this in the real world with that anecdote you shared at the top, the story of Elias, the third-generation dialmaker in the Chaux de Fonds. The source material really shares his plight, and it illustrates exactly how these macro policies hit these specialized small to medium enterprises.
Elias's situation is the perfect microcosm of the systemic failure the 39% tariff caused. I mean, here's a guy who makes high-precision components, the tiny, intricate dials and pinions used in luxury watches and specialized medical devices.
A family business.
Right. His firm is famous for quality, but his profit margin is already tight. We're talking maybe 10 to 15% on average. So when the 39% tariff was imposed, Elias had a choice.
An impossible choice.
An impossible choice. Either raise his price by 39% for his U.S. clients, who would then immediately switch to German or Japanese competitors paying only 15%, or
absorb the 39% himself, which would drive his margin deep into the negative.
Precisely. The U.S. market represents about 25% of his business. He was bleeding cash. And he told us he was preparing to let go of his two most promising young apprentices.
And these are skills you can't just learn from a textbook.
No, these are specialized skill sets passed down through generations that, once they're lost, are incredibly difficult to recover. So that 24% difference between 39 and the new 15% rate, it isn't just a bump in profit. For Elias and for hundreds of other specialized SMEs, it's the difference between closing down a century-old trade and keeping those specialized skill sets alive for the next generation. It's a pure lifeline.
Let's look at the specific sector-level relief that this move to 15% provides. And we have to start with watches, the most iconic and structurally the most exposed sector.
The watch industry was definitely the hardest hit. It accounts for roughly 4 billion Swiss francs in annual exports to the U.S. And the 39% tariff just created a logistical nightmare. Luxury brands like Rolex, Breitling, Patek Philippe, Omega, they found themselves in a real crisis.
They rely so much on brand equity, but even premium customers have their limits. Were they actually raising prices immediately?
Some attempted it, which led to immediate price gouging for American consumers. That, of course, risked diluting the brand.
A huge risk.
A huge risk. So others chose to delay shipments, trying to rush inventory into the U.S. ahead of tariff deadlines, or just hoping the tariffs would be temporary. This created these massive inventory backlogs in Switzerland and, at the same time, artificial shortages in the American market.
And the U.S. is a critical market for them.
It's huge. It accounts for roughly 20% of all Swiss watch exports. So losing that competitive equilibrium there was just devastating to their overall global sales targets.
So with the reduction to 15%, how quickly do we expect prices to normalize for American consumers?
The normalization should be swift. I mean, look, 15% is still a duty, and you can bet the Swiss watch industry will continue to lobby for parity with the UK's 10% rate. But it aligns Switzerland with the rate the EU pays.
And that consistency is key.
It's everything. It allows pricing strategies to stabilize. We expect a rapid easing of those inventory backlogs that build up. And more importantly, it restores competitive equilibrium. Swiss watches are now competing with Japanese, German, and French luxury goods on quality and brand, not on a punishing, politically imposed cost structure.
Okay, moving beyond luxury, we have the machinery and precision tool sector. This is strategically vital. We're talking 3 billion francs annually in high-value goods.
Right, and this is really the backbone of Swiss industrial expertise. These are highly sophisticated, often customized tools, things, specialized lathes, micro-component manufacturing systems, advanced robotics.
And unlike the big pharma conglomerates, many of these are SMEs, right? Like Elias's firm.
Exactly. A lot of these machinery firms are SMEs, entirely Swiss-based. Their products are absolutely mission-critical for American manufacturing. And that 39% tariff was causing U.S. factories to either pay these exorbitant rates or, source inferior substitutes. That's actually why U.S. industrial interests pushed so hard for this tariff reduction.
And then we have the largest and most complex sector, pharmaceuticals. This was the big exemption, but the risk hanging over it was immense.
Pharmaceuticals are Switzerland's largest export category by a huge margin. Along with semiconductors and precious metals, they were temporarily exempt from that initial 39% tariff.
But that exemption came with a massive political club hanging over them.
It did, and the U.S. made that threat explicit.
How so?
In mid-2025, the U.S. specifically warned 17 major healthcare companies, including giants like Novartis and Roche, to lower their drug prices for U.S. consumers or face retaliation.
And that retaliation was defined as?
As potentially revoking the exemptions and applying punitive tariffs to their products. This created just an unacceptable level of regulatory uncertainty for companies that plan investments decades in advance.
So the new framework deal had to address this threat head-on.
It did. It provides major stability. The deal promptly ensures that the reciprocal tariff does not exceed 15% for originating pharmaceutical goods and semiconductors that are subject to Section 2032 tariffs.
Let's pause on Section 232. For our listener, what does that mean in this context? Why is that specific section so important?
Right. Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Expansion Act allows the U.S. president to impose tariffs on imports if the Commerce Secretary determines those imports threaten national security.
National security. So this is key.
It's absolutely key because it frames the issue geopolitically, not just commercially. By explicitly limiting the Section 232 tariff risk on pharma and semiconductors to 15%, the U.S. is essentially declaring that these Swiss products are now considered stable, reliable inputs that contribute to, rather than threaten, U.S. economic security.
It's a formalized security blanket for these massive companies.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Now, before we get into the details of the agreement itself, let's quickly touch on the strategic decisions the large firms were taking while they were operating under that 39% wall. They didn't just sit there and panic.
That's right. Large multinational firms had very sophisticated mitigation strategies. Analysts suggested they viewed the 39% tariff as the lesser evil compared to fundamentally restructuring their global price models.
Why is that?
Think about it. If a company like Rolex were to lower its global wholesale price by 39% just for the U.S., that price change would ripple across Europe, Asia, and other markets. It could potentially destroy their margins worldwide.
And they could use their global footprint to mitigate the impact as well.
Exactly. Tariffs only apply to the final product at the border based on its official country of origin. Large Swiss firms use these complex international production chains. So if a product underwent what's called substantial transformation in a third country, say, being finished or assembled in Mexico or Ireland, they could potentially change the official country of origin for customs purposes.
Thereby limiting the impact of the Swiss-specific tariff.
Right. It was, financial engineering on an international scale.
Okay, let's turn to the details of the actual framework deal itself. The agreement on reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. This 15% reduction wasn't a gift. It required some major commitments from Switzerland.
Absolutely not a gift. The agreement mandates a cumulative reciprocal tariff rate of no higher than 15% for both Switzerland and Liechtenstein, formally matching the EU rate. And in return, Switzerland made very concrete market access commitments, which are crucial for U.S. exporters.
So what specifically is Switzerland opening its agricultural and industrial markets to?
They committed to removing a range of tariffs across specific sectors. This includes things like nuts, certain fish and seafood, chemicals, and spirits like American whiskey and rum. This is really about making U.S. goods more competitive on Swiss shelves.
And what about the highly protected Swiss agricultural market? Did they manage to crack that open slightly for the U.S.?
They did, and this is crucial. Switzerland committed to establishing what are called tariff rate quotas, or TRQs, for U.S. poultry, beef, and bison.
And a TRQ means what exactly?
It means they allow a certain volume of American meat imports at a very low or even zero tariff rate. After that quota is filled, a much higher tariff kicks in, so it provides a measurable, if still limited, opening into what is a traditionally very protectionist market.
Okay.
They also committed to addressing some of these restrictive non-tariff barriers related to dairy and just simplifying customs procedures overall.
Beyond streamlining trade, the deal included a massive investment quid pro quo, the $200 billion commitment. I mean, this is what truly captured the headlines in Washington.
Oh, this is the defining financial commitment that made the whole deal politically palatable in the U.S. Swiss and Liechtenstein companies committed to investing at least $200 billion into the U.S. economy over 5 years.
And a big chunk of that is front-loaded.
A huge chunk. $67 billion is explicitly slated to occur in 2026 alone.
Where is that money going?
It's heavily targeted. It's going into high-growth, strategic sectors where the U.S. wants to build supply chain resilience. So we're talking pharmaceuticals, advanced machinery, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing. This isn't just passive capital investment. This is building factories and creating industrial capacity in the U.S.
And the U.S. side explicitly tied monitoring this investment to how the tariffs are applied.
They did. This is a mechanism designed to ensure compliance and, frankly, political benefit realization. The framework states that the U.S. will monitor these investments along with the associated job creation, and it specifically notes commitments to fund registered apprenticeships for U.S. workers when applying the reciprocal tariffs.
So it guarantees that the benefits of the trade deal are realized on American soil.
And it provides tangible evidence of a win for U.S. manufacturing.
The ultimate goal of the entire package is incredibly ambitious. Eliminating the U.S. goods trade deficit with Switzerland and Liechtenstein, which was, $38.5 billion in 2024 by 2028. That's a huge shift in trade dynamics.
It is a profound shift. But we also have to acknowledge the new reality for Switzerland. While the tariff reduction is massive relief, it just puts them on par with the EU rate of 15%.
That's a crucial point.
It means the margin for error remains very thin. Swiss exporters now have to rely purely on their quality and their efficiency, not on some favorable trade regime.
So the export economy has its stability restored. But as you mentioned in the opening, stability is simultaneously being redefined back in Zurich. We need to transition now to the internal earthquake that is redefining Swiss finance.
And this transition is crucial because the franc's strength, which is driven partly by this renewed confidence in the SNB policy, acts as a structural force that directly impacts the competitiveness of those very same exporters we just discussed.
Let's transition from that external trade wall being torn down to an internal monetary pillar being completely dismantled. The SNB definitively killed negative interest rates, ending what felt like an eternal experiment in Swiss finance.
It was a necessary move, one that was really dictated by the economy. You see, negative rates were a tool deployed primarily to fight the appreciation of the Swiss franc, which the SNB felt was too strong.
Right, the strong franc problem.
Exactly. But by 2024 and 2025, the primary argument for that kind of extreme easing had vanished. Switzerland experienced persistent declining inflation. It fell sharply in 2024 to an annual rate of 1.1% and then just slid further to a very, very low 0.1% by June of 2025.
That low inflation gave them the room to move.
It gave them the political and the economic room to move, yes. The SNB cut its policy rate to 0.5% in December 2024, and that was followed by the symbolic and definitive cut to 0.0% on June 19th, 2025. The move to zero was the end of a decade-long policy that had made Swiss monetary policy an international anomaly.
But the true policy earthquake wasn't just hitting zero. It was the commitment against ever going back into negative territory. That changes the structural foundation of the economy.
It absolutely does. SNB Chairman Martin Schlegel definitively ruled out any return to negative interest rates. And he justified this commitment by citing expectations that inflation will rise slightly in the coming quarters.
So it's signaling a fundamentally hawkish monetary stance.
Yes, one designed to maintain current rates for an extended period. This is a profound structural commitment to traditional monetary policy that is meant to restore confidence.
And we saw in the source material how negative rates weren't just an economic tool. They were a profound psychological weight on the Swiss people and the country's identity. That anecdote about Renate, the retired school teacher, it perfectly captures the shift in the national psyche.
Renete's experience resonates across the entire population of savers in Switzerland. She described negative rates as a fundamental psychological shock. You have to remember, Switzerland is a nation built on prudence, on thrift, on stability.
And paying banks to hold your money just feels wrong.
It feels like a betrayal of a core Swiss promise. It effectively punishes the very act of saving.
It creates all these perverse incentives.
Exactly. For someone like Renate, a retired school teacher who needs a stable safety net, negative rates just reduce the perceived reward of keeping cash safe. She told us she felt compelled to push her safety net into riskier assets, like stocks or complex funds, merely to prevent her capital from slowly eroding.
And so the return to zero is more than just a number.
It's a restoration of dignity to savings. The explicit promise against negative rates reaffirms that long-term Swiss promise that stability is the reward for prudence.
Structurally, this commitment confirms Switzerland's unique position. The headline interest rate is now significantly below the main refinancing rates of the Eurozone, which is at 2.15% in mid-2025, and the U.S. Fed at 4.25–4.50%.
That divergence is massive. But while this brings stability for savers, it simultaneously creates immediate, intense financial pressure that demands strategic changes from the Swiss banking sector. The short-term windfall that banks enjoyed, it's gone.
Let's delve into those profound implications for the banking sector, particularly the end of that temporary positive rate era. I mean, the collapse of that income boost was almost instantaneous.
It was definitive. The shift to 0% interest rates definitively evaporates the substantial interest income boost that banks had enjoyed in 2022 and 2023.
And that boost was driven by what exactly?
It was driven by the SNB paying interest on the bank's sight deposits. That peaked at a staggering 7.4 billion Swiss francs in 2023. I mean, that's up sharply from less than $1 billion the year before. That entire revenue stream is now gone, forcing banks to confront their true structural profitability.
And the sector's overall financial health reflects this pressure vividly.
Oh, they absolutely do. Aggregate net income for Swiss banks fell 3.5% in 2024. But more tellingly, the result from core interest operations fell sharply by 13.5%, dropping from 24.3 billion francs to 21.1 billion.
And overall profit?
Overall annual profit dropped 31.7%. And this pressure was really concentrated among the domestically focused banks, where the net interest margin contracted by 8% in 2024 alone.
This sounds like a severe margin squeeze, particularly for those domestically focused banks, the cantonal and regional banks, which rely so heavily on mortgage lending. Why didn't their refinancing costs ease even as the policy rate returned to zero?
That's the core mechanical problem. The return to zero rates intensifies the margin pressure because their refinancing costs have not eased proportionally.
Why not?
Well, a few reasons. Tighter market liquidity, rising capital requirements like the early implementation of Basel III that we'll get to, and increased funding spreads have all made lending structurally more expensive for them.
So they can't easily pass those costs on to mortgage customers?
No, because of the competition. So they are trapped between rising wholesale funding costs and intense competitive pressure on their lending rates.
If the traditional interest-driven model is insufficient and that interest income boost has evaporated, banks have to pivot their entire revenue strategy. What does this new strategy even look like?
The new normal requires a complete proactive revenue protection playbook. Banks simply cannot rely on the abundance of central bank liquidity or expanding mortgage portfolios at scale using cheap funding anymore. The whole strategy pivots toward extreme efficiency and deep client relationship management.
Give us some specifics on that pivot. What does proactive revenue protection mean day to day?
First, they have to refine their lending strategy. They have to move away from assessing risk and pricing based on isolated product margins and toward what's called relationship pricing.
So factoring in the entire client relationship.
Exactly. Deposits, investments, advisory services, lending, all of it. If a client holds substantial managed assets with the bank, they get a better lending rate. Second, they must broaden and optimize their funding bases, actively applying differentiated pricing strategies across their deposit segments. They have to recognize that high-quality, stable liquidity is now a high-cost commodity.
And the role of technology in client acquisition has become much more aggressive, right?
Absolutely. Professional acquisition management is now critical. Banks have to use advanced analytics and AI to identify attractive target segments, tailor their value propositions, and improve lead prioritization. The old ways of passively waiting for wealth to flow in are just insufficient.
So it's a full-scale commercial strategy overhaul.
It is. They have to enhance the client value proposition, offering modular mortgage solutions, designing hybrid investment solutions that bridge advisory and discretionary models, and strengthening loyalty through customized ecosystem offerings. It's about shifting the steering from the product level to the relationship level of profitability.
It sounds like the decline in interest income is forcing a greater reliance on fee-based activities, but even those revenues are showing signs of fragility.
They are very fragile. The overall revenue mix in 2024 was only held up by non-core activities, specifically trading.
Which is volatile.
Very. Trading activities saw a massive rise of 38.4% in 2024, but that stemmed primarily from market volatility, a temporary phenomenon. Meanwhile, commission income, the fee-based income from services like investment and wealth management, has stagnated.
How badly?
Since peaking in 2021, commission income has dropped by more than 3.5 billion francs, and it remained flat at 22.4 billion in 2024. This just highlights the vulnerability of the fee-based model and the urgent need for banks to extract more consistent long-term value from their client relationships to truly compensate for the definitive end of that positive rate environment.
The monetary shift demands a structural revolution, but let's circle back to the trade deal for a moment. Because the U.S. decision to lower the tariff wasn't just a response to Swiss economic pain. It was driven by hard-nosed geopolitical strategy. The source material suggests the U.S. motivation wasn't anything close to charity.
That's the most important context here. The reduction of tariffs from 39% down to 15% was purely strategic. The U.S. views this as securing its own long-term industrial and national security interests.
How so?
As we noted, that 39% tariff was described by some American trade analysts as a self-inflicted wound.
A self-inflicted wound because
it was blocking U.S. industry from reliably accessing the best, highest quality tools in the world, namely specialized Swiss machinery and advanced manufacturing components that are necessary for defense and high-tech civilian sectors.
So the U.S. is prioritizing curating its trade partners based on supply chain reliability over simply punishing trade deficits based on, well, distorted statistics.
Precisely. In a globally unstable environment, the U.S. strategy is all about maximizing supply chain resilience. They have to secure critical inputs, pharmaceuticals, high-tech machinery, semiconductors from loyal, advanced nations they can trust.
And Switzerland fits that bill.
Perfectly. This deal locks in a loyal, high-quality, advanced ally in Europe, a neutral nation with deep financial reserves before the global stage gets even messier. The geopolitical motivation is about resilience, technological access, and alliance building against potentially unreliable sources.
Let's discuss the specific economic security provisions that are embedded in the framework, because they really confirm this strategic shift goes far beyond simple duties.
The framework deal is just loaded with these security provisions, and it reflects the urgency of this pivot. Both nations committed to strengthening cooperation on export controls, sanctions enforcement, and investment screening.
So they're harmonizing their approach.
Yes. For example, they're agreeing to harmonize how they vet foreign investments, particularly those coming from high-risk geopolitical rivals, ensuring a united front on economic security.
And there's a strong component aimed at ensuring reciprocal benefits in government procurement, which often flies under the radar.
Yes, and this is important. Switzerland and Liechtenstein committed to closing loopholes that currently allow countries that are not party to the government procurement agreement or free trade agreements to access their procurement markets.
And what's the practical effect of that?
It's a critical move designed to ensure greater reciprocal benefits for U.S. products and services in Swiss public tenders. It effectively creates a clearer advantage for U.S. companies over non-ally competitors, for instance, state-owned enterprises from China or Russia in the Swiss procurement space.
It really feels like the U.S. is explicitly creating a defined strategic tier in its trade relationships.
That is exactly how analysts are viewing it. This deal creates a clear two-tier system where actively engaging dealmakers, like Switzerland, who commit billions in investment and agree to crucial security provisions, get significantly better terms than holdouts or non-aligned partners.
So paying 15% is the reward for alignment.
and paying 39% or more is the penalty for rigidity. This sends a powerful signal to other countries that cooperation, coupled with significant investment pledges, gets rewarded with secured market access.
And finally, the high-stakes diplomacy that secured this deal. It wasn't just technocrats in a room. It involved the CEOs of global powerhouses.
The choreography was absolutely essential to the political success of this deal. The breakthrough followed a high-level delegation of Swiss business leaders, and this notably included the CEOs of giants like Rolex's Jean-Frédéric Dufour and Richemont's chairman Johann Rupert meeting directly with President Trump.
And their presence underscored the economic pain.
Enormously. The presence of the luxury sector CEOs underscored the enormous economic pain the tariffs were inflicting, and it put a human face on the manufacturing crisis.
And the $200 billion investment pledge provided the political justification for the U.S. administration to make the deal?
It was the necessary counterbalance. That $200 billion, the largest expansion ever of U.S. exporter access to Swiss markets and investment commitments on U.S. soil, it offsets any narrative that the U.S. was simply capitulating to pressure.
Right. It framed the deal as a massive win for U.S. jobs.
A win for U.S. jobs, economic security, and industrial capacity. It ensured that the final outcome, reducing tariffs to 15%, was palatable domestically in the U.S., while providing that immediate massive relief to the Swiss export economy.
We've covered the dramatic relief on trade and the profound internal shift in monetary policy. Now, let's tie this all back to the core stability of the Swiss financial system. How is it coping with all this volatility and the ongoing structural changes?
Overall, the Swiss banking system has maintained good resilience, despite the shocks from the end of positive rates and, of course, the Credit Suisse crisis fallout. Switzerland continues to be seen as a safe haven, and that's primarily reflected in its assets under management, or AUM, figures.
Which, paradoxically, hit a record high in 2024.
Yes, AUM reached a record high of 9,284 billion Swiss francs in 2024, a 10.6% increase year-on-year. This reflects the global recovery in equity markets and Switzerland's persistent role as the world's leading center for cross-border wealth management. Global wealth flows towards stability, and Switzerland provides that.
However, the source material notes a subtle yet significant reversal in the first half of 2025, and it's related to currency effects. Tell us about that.
This is a crucial detail that illustrates the complexity of managing global wealth. AUM actually fell slightly by 0.6% in the first half of 2025.
But why?
The decline was almost entirely attributable to foreign domiciled customers. And the reason is structural. Foreign customers hold a much higher proportion of their assets in currencies like the US dollar and the euro.
Okay.
Since the Swiss franc appreciated significantly against these major currencies, driven partly by the trade deal optimism and the SNB's commitment against negative rates, those foreign assets, when converted back into Swiss francs for reporting purposes, suddenly lost value.
So the very strengthening of the franc, which is a sign of confidence, actually caused the headline AUM numbers to drop slightly just due to conversion mechanics. That's a true double-edged sword.
Precisely. And it masks the fact that net inflows of new money remain positive, but the currency effect created this statistical headwind. Meanwhile, domestic customers' holdings remain stable or slightly increased. So despite the volatility, the persistently high volume of assets underscores the continued trust in Swiss banking.
Moving from global wealth management to domestic risk, the Swiss financial authorities remain highly focused on one particular area, the mortgage market. Why is this still the subject of such persistent warnings?
The mortgage market remains the single largest asset item for Swiss banks. It makes up 38.2% of all bank assets. That is a massive exposure. The SNB and FINMA, the financial regulator, consistently warn of persistent risks for a few reasons.
Such as?
First, loan-to-value ratios remain historically high in many regions. Second, the prolonged period of low interest rates encourage some banks to relax their lending standards slightly.
And certain types of banks are more exposed than others to this.
Absolutely. The domestically oriented cantonal banks and regional savings banks hold the largest share of this market, at 40.1% at the end of 2024. Their reliance on net interest income from mortgages, combined with those higher refinancing costs we discussed earlier, means any significant downturn in real estate or rise in defaults would hit them very hard.
Now, the regulatory response to the Credit Suisse crisis accelerated decisive action to strengthen banking regulation, particularly the too big to fail framework. And Switzerland is actually ahead of its peers in implementing key global standards here.
They are showing leadership. Switzerland implemented the key capital adequacy reform package known as Basel III Final, effective January 2025. And this is notably ahead of the EU, the UK, and the US, who all delayed their implementation until 2026 or later.
Implementing it early sounds highly responsible, but the critique suggested this creates temporary competitive disadvantages. How does adopting Basel III Final ahead of the curve penalize Swiss banks?
It's a classic regulatory trade-off. While it strengthens resilience, it forces Swiss banks to face higher compliance costs and stricter capital demands sooner than their international rivals.
And what does that mean in practice?
Specifically, Basel III Final introduces output floors for calculating risk-weighted assets. This limits the ability of banks to use their own internal models to reduce their capital requirements. It also imposes stricter leverage ratio buffers. And all these requirements translate into significant one-time and recurring operating costs, placing greater immediate pressure on Swiss banks compared to rivals who get to operate under the older, lighter standards for another year or two.
Beyond Basel III, the Federal Council proposed a comprehensive too-big-to-fail package in June 2025. What are the core elements aimed at strengthening capital and liquidity in a crisis?
The package is comprehensive, yes. It focuses on three key areas: stricter capital adequacy requirements, improved liquidity provision, and governance reforms. For liquidity, the centerpiece is the introduction of a state-guaranteed public liquidity backstop, or PLB.
What exactly is a public liquidity backstop, and how does that differ from traditional central bank emergency lending?
A public liquidity backstop is designed to provide rapid, secured liquidity to a systemically important bank that's facing a crisis, beyond what the SNB can provide under its existing legal framework, which requires lending against good collateral.
So it's an extra layer of protection.
It is. The PLB is state-guaranteed, meaning the government provides a guarantee to the SNB, and that allows the SNB to provide immediate liquidity, even if the bank's available collateral is degraded or illiquid during the crisis. It's an extra layer of crisis protection, ensuring rapid intervention without exhausting the central bank's own resources or violating its strict collateral rules.
The package also includes a specific, highly technical measure supported by the SNB that targets the capital backing of foreign subsidiaries. This is the CET1 deduction measure. Why is this so crucial for the parent bank's stability?
This measure is critical for strengthening the parent bank's capital underpinning and protecting the Swiss economy from the failures of foreign subsidiaries. The Federal Council proposes that participations in foreign banking subsidiaries be fully deducted from common equity Tier 1 capital.
And for the listener, CET1 capital is essentially the highest quality capital, the core equity. Why would you deduct foreign participations from it?
You deduct it because the risk associated with foreign subsidiaries is higher and, frankly, harder to control. Losses incurred by a foreign unit due to local market crashes or local regulatory failures can immediately and negatively impact the parent bank's balance sheet through the consolidation mechanism.
I see.
By requiring the bank to fully deduct these participations from their CET1, it forces the bank to hold a higher, cleaner pool of capital at the parent level. This makes losses in foreign units less likely to immediately impact domestic stability. The SNB's vice chairman, Antoine Martin, supports this, noting it is the best solution from a financial stability perspective because it ring-fences the Swiss operation.
Finally, let's look at the employment outlook in the banking sector. Despite all this volatility and the massive UBS Credit Suisse integration, has the sector held steady?
Domestically, yes. The employment outlook remains cautiously resilient. The domestic number of full-time equivalents, or FTEs, remains stable. It fell by only 0.1% in the first half of 2025.
But the overall headcount did fall.
It did, by 1.7%, but that was entirely due to job cuts abroad, which were accelerated by the UBS Credit Suisse integration. That involved eliminating duplicate structures in their international units.
So core domestic wealth management and retail banking jobs are holding up, even as the global giants streamline their international operations.
Exactly. The stability in the domestic headcount reflects that banks are retaining talent in core, high-value areas like wealth management, trading, and relationship management. And the outlook for the second half of 2025 is fundamentally upbeat. 96% of the banks surveyed expect their domestic headcount to remain stable or even rise.
That's a strong signal.
It shows that despite the end of the rate boost and the new regulatory demands, the fundamental drivers of the Swiss financial sector, global wealth, quality of talent, and stability remain highly attractive.
So if we step back and look at these two parallel narratives, we see an economy undergoing simultaneous external relief and internal restructuring. On one side, The trade deal provides immediate, measurable relief, slashing that 39% tariff wall down to 15. This clear boost stabilizes export sectors like watches, machinery, and pharmaceuticals, cementing Switzerland's role as a reliable, high-quality supply chain partner for the world's largest economy.
And on the other, you have the SMBs move away from the long controversial experiment of negative rates. This shift restores domestic confidence and financial dignity for savers, moving monetary policy back toward traditional stability. But this move demands a complete commercial strategy overhaul for every bank, forcing them to pivot sharply away from reliance on interest income toward hyper-efficient operations and deep, relationship-based client service.
And the system is being fortified.
Right. The financial system is not just being managed, it is being aggressively fortified with that early Basel III adoption and the crucial too-big-to-fail reforms like the CET1 deduction mechanism.
The combined effect is that Switzerland is not just weathering global storms, it is actively recalibrating its core identity for the next few decades. The high-stakes trade deal ensures its economic viability in export markets, while the decisive monetary and regulatory pivot ensures its internal financial stability and its continued status as a neutral safe harbor for global capital.
And the lesson here really is that in a world of increasing volatility and geopolitical uncertainty, neutrality, when it's paired with high-quality and proactive regulation, is suddenly a far more valuable commodity than its previous status might have suggested.